The United States Supreme Court has delivered a historic rebuke to presidential power, striking down the sweeping tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump during his second term. These tariffs had been a cornerstone of his economic policy, aimed at protecting American industries and reducing the trade deficit. This landmark case tested the separation of powers, clarifying that Congress, not the president, holds primary authority over trade and taxation. The ruling emphasized the importance of checks and balances in the U.S. government. President Trump had invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to justify tariffs on nearly all imports, citing a national emergency. This move was seen as an overreach of executive power by many legal experts. The Supreme Court disagreed, ruling that such a dramatic shift in economic policy required explicit congressional approval. The justices argued that the president could not unilaterally impose such significant economic measures without legislative backing. The decision will unwind increased costs on imported goods, providing relief to businesses and consumers. Many small business owners and retailers had struggled with the higher prices resulting from the tariffs. More importantly, it sets a precedent limiting any future president's ability to bypass Congress on major economic issues. This ruling reinforces the constitutional framework designed to prevent the concentration of too much power in any single branch of government. This Supreme Court showdown has redefined the balance of power in Washington, ensuring Congress retains its constitutional authority over trade and taxation. The decision marks a significant moment in the ongoing debate over the limits of executive power. A tariff is a tax placed on goods that are brought into a country from abroad. When a product crosses a border, the government can charge an extra fee, making those imported goods more expensive for consumers and businesses. Tariffs have been used for centuries as a tool of economic policy, shaping the way nations trade with each other and influencing the prices of everyday items. Governments use tariffs for several reasons: to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, to generate revenue for the state, or to penalize other countries for actions seen as unfair or harmful. In the United States, Congress has traditionally held the power to set tariffs, carefully balancing the interests of American workers, businesses, and consumers. However, in early 2025, President Trump took the unprecedented step of imposing sweeping new tariffs, some reaching as high as 50%, on goods imported from nearly every country in the world. This marked a dramatic shift in U.S. trade policy, affecting everything from electronics and clothing to cars and raw materials. To justify these sweeping actions, President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, declaring a national emergency. He argued that the country faced urgent threats to both national security and the economy, and that immediate action was necessary to protect American interests. The administration's tariffs were divided into two main categories. First, there were trafficking tariffs, which specifically targeted Canada, China, and Mexico. These were justified by concerns over the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the United States, with the administration claiming that higher tariffs would pressure these countries to take stronger action. Second, there were reciprocal tariffs designed to address the persistent U.S. trade deficit. The goal was to encourage other countries to lower their own trade barriers and to make American exports more competitive on the global stage. This move represented a radical expansion of presidential emergency powers, using IEEPA in a way it had never been used before, to create a sweeping new system of taxation by executive order, bypassing Congress entirely. Historically, IEEPA was intended for targeted sanctions against specific threats, such as rogue states or terrorist organizations, not for broad economic policy affecting nearly every American business and consumer. Critics from across the political spectrum argued that this was a massive overreach of executive authority, directly challenging Congress's constitutional role in setting taxes and regulating trade. As a result, the stage was set for a historic legal battle over the limits of presidential power, with the future of American trade policy and the balance of power in government hanging in the balance. The tariffs hit small and medium-sized businesses hardest, forcing many to choose between raising prices or facing financial ruin. Companies like Learning Resources and Hand 2 faced millions in new costs, threatening their survival. Terry Cycling, a small apparel company, projected an extra $1.2 million in expenses, an existential threat. States joined the fight, arguing that tariffs drove up costs for public institutions and strained taxpayer budgets. The opposition argued the president had exceeded his lawful authority, bypassing Congress and creating economic chaos. Their lawsuits sought to restore the constitutional balance of power. The coalition of businesses and states formed the backbone of the legal challenge. Their case was about more than economics. It was about defending the Constitution. The legal battle began in lower courts, where judges expressed skepticism about the administration's broad claims of executive power. Courts repeatedly ruled that the president had exceeded authority under IEPA, with key decisions finding the tariffs unlawful. The Trump administration appealed, arguing the courts were interfering with presidential responsibilities in foreign policy. The case advanced to the federal circuit, which ruled that such sweeping tariffs required clear congressional authorization. Undeterred, the administration appealed to the Supreme Court. Recognizing the national importance, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis. The stage was set for a historic constitutional showdown. At the Supreme Court, the Trump administration presented its case, arguing that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, granted the president sweeping authority to impose tariffs as a tool of economic regulation. They emphasized that in times of crisis, the executive branch must have the flexibility to respond quickly to foreign threats and national emergencies, even if that means taking bold economic action. The administration's lawyers maintained that Congress had intentionally given the president this broad discretion, trusting the executive to act in the nation's best interest. They argued that if Congress disagreed with the president's actions, it always retained the power to step in and override those decisions through legislation. The administration insisted that the courts should defer to the president on matters of national security and foreign policy, warning that judicial interference could undermine the government's ability to protect the country. On the other side, the challengers forcefully countered that IEPA never explicitly authorized the use of tariffs, and that the Constitution clearly assigns the power to tax and regulate commerce to Congress alone. They invoked the major questions doctrine, arguing that for actions of vast economic and political significance, only clear and unmistakable congressional authorization would suffice. Anything less, they warned, would set a dangerous precedent. Overhauling the entire tariff system, the challengers argued, was a fundamental legislative, not executive, function, and allowing the president to do so would upset the careful balance of powers established by the Constitution. The challengers warned that if the president could impose sweeping taxes or tariffs unilaterally, it would erode the separation of powers and threaten the very foundation of American democracy. The Supreme Court was now faced with a momentous question. Could the president, acting alone, fundamentally rewrite the nation's trade and tax policy, or did such power rest solely with Congress? The stakes in this case were nothing less than the constitutional balance between Congress and the executive branch, a decision that would shape the limits of presidential power for years to come. The Supreme Court sided with the challengers, affirming Congress's constitutional authority over trade and taxation. The majority opinion found IEPA did not grant the president clear authority to impose tariffs on such a massive scale. The court relied on the major questions doctrine, requiring explicit congressional approval for transformative policies. Congress had not intended to delegate its core taxing power so broadly. The ruling rejected the idea that a national emergency declaration placed the president's actions beyond judicial review. The court emphasized that all executive actions must remain within legal boundaries set by Congress. By striking down the tariffs, the court defended the separation of powers and the legislative control of taxation. The decision was not about trade policy itself, but about who has the authority to make such decisions. The Supreme Court's decision immediately invalidates the broad tariffs, providing relief to businesses and lowering costs for consumers. The ruling restores stability to international trade and validates the legal challenge by businesses and states. For companies like Tariffs and the coalition of states, it means survival and budget relief. The decision curtails any president's ability to use emergency powers for major economic policies without Congress. It reasserts Congress's role as the primary author of trade and tax laws. Future presidents will need explicit legislation for broad tariffs, shifting the process to democratic debate. Major trade decisions will now require public scrutiny and consensus, not unilateral executive action. The ruling strengthens checks and balances at the heart of American governance. The Supreme Court's ruling will be remembered as a defining moment for the Constitution's separation of powers. By overturning the tariffs, The court defended the rule of law and the limits of executive authority. The decision sets a high bar for future presidents seeking to use emergency powers to bypass Congress. It ensures that major economic decisions are made through open debate in Congress, not by executive order. The ruling brings stability to trade policy and reaffirms the power of an independent judiciary. In a polarized era, this case proves that constitutional principles remain binding and vital. It is a powerful reminder that the United States is a government of laws, not of men.